Henry Newman is here in the studio with us from Open Europe think tank. Welcome back to the programme. Steve Baker, yesterday, he resigned as Brexit Minister, and he said that the Chequers proposal would not allow the UK to have proper control of what goes on in the country. Do you agree with him?
It's right to a degree, yeah. It is explicitly giving up certain control over goods regulation. That's absolutely right. But I think that most people recognise now that there needs to be a compromise. Parliament's divided. There are obviously a split between Brexiteers and Remainers. The country's also divided. So it's a case of trying to find a compromise solution that can work for the country and can work for Parliament, but also be negotiable with the EU. And I think that's what the Prime Minister tried to do at Chequers. To my mind, she went a little bit too far with the compromises. But overall, it's a good thing that we have a plan now. It's taken 2 years. It's not a perfect plan. But perhaps a plan is better than no plan, to coin a phrase.
Do you agree?
Well, we need a plan. There's no doubt about that. We need a proposal to take to the European Commission. It's taken ages, quite frankly, to get to this situation. But, Joe, I'm not going to rerun my comments of earlier on. It is problematic. This is still a problematic proposal because, I've touched on common rule book, mobility framework. Will we be able to go out and strike free trade agreements, for example? We are going to become a rule taker. What happens to our ability to do trade with other countries outside of the European Union on mutual recognition terms and things of that nature?
Priti was saying we don't know yet what Brussels will say. Brussels has said so far the single market is a binary choice. You can either have the whole thing or nothing. So there are calls from people like Chuka to soften the red lines and to rub some of them out and move them around a bit. There's no point doing that if Brussels is saying it's either the whole single market or none. So she's put forward something. I think we can disagree about some of the details, but broadly it's a generous offer. And if Brussels says no, I think the alternative will have to be a looser relationship.
Let's pick up on Priti's point about doing free trade deals. Doesn't this make it very, very difficult? Who is going to want to do a free trade deal with the UK if they're not able to agree or impose their standards and regulations on goods?
It would certainly make it a little bit harder. That's true. But I think if you look at Switzerland, which broadly follows EU rules for goods and agriculture, they've been able to do free trade deals. And they've been able to do a free trade deal with China. It's not a particularly deep deal, but that's a relatively small country. We're a much bigger country, so I'm not as pessimistic about that. I think if the government's customs plan works, then we'd also have the ability to, if it works, we'd have the ability to vary our tariffs, and that'd be crucial because we could lower our tariffs on agriculture in particular, and that is an attractive offer.
Except Willie Johnson, who is the US ambassador to the UK, actually is rather concerned about it. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
I think the bilat will be an important discussion that he'll have with the Prime Minister, and we'll see what happens with Brexit. I don't think anybody really knows yet. We know that there was an important meeting at Chequers, but what it really means at this point, I think, is still up in the air.
So, it doesn't look promising, does it, in terms of free trade deals?
Look, the Americans, President Trump's clear. America first. They're going to play hardball. They've already just whacked a 25% tariff on our steel by dint of us being part of the EU, and we're trying to do so in terms of some of our aircraft manufacturers, Bombardier. But, Henry's right in the sense that from the EU's point of view, it's all or nothing in terms of the structures being part of the European Economic Area and the Customs Union. I would want us to be fully part of both. I take the rule maker, rule receiver point, but frankly, as I said to Priti earlier, if you're going to sell into those markets, there will be a demand that you comply with their standards and regulations. But in terms of how the EU will take this, I've spoken to senior officials at the Commission and the Council over the last 2 to 3 days, and I think it's fair to say they want to give the Prime Minister space. They're not immediately going to shoot down what comes forward in the White Paper, I think is now being delayed to next week, but it won't work is what I have been told for them. But what they do welcome is after 2 years, this is the first serious proposition that has been put in front of them. And given the clock is ticking, that is a degree of progress. But from their point of view, they see this as damage limitation. They don't want to punish the UK. And you can't do a kind of pick and mix. We've got to make our decisions. So what the Prime Minister's tried to do is a kind of half in the single market and the customs union, half out.
Except that there are already lots of examples of arrangements like that which the EU has already agreed. Now, they may not want to offer that again, but they've offered it already in different versions to Ukraine, to Switzerland and to other countries. And I think we can turn this around a bit and say to Brussels, what do you actually want? Of course they didn't ask for Brexit, but the UK is exercising a right that is specifically afforded in the EU treaties to leave the EU through Article 50.
There's one very big difference there.
Maybe, but they've offered us two choices, one of which is a Canada-style free trade deal, but with the proviso that we lose control of Northern Ireland. Obviously unacceptable. And the other option is essentially single market plus customs union, a relationship even closer than Norway's, which wouldn't allow us to control free movement. Those are ridiculous and unsustainable options. So they need to think very carefully about what they're doing here.
But there's two things about that. First of all, you're absolutely right about Northern Ireland. That's a big difference, obviously, between us, Switzerland and Ukraine and the rest. And it's written into law. People seem to have ignored that fact. Clause 10 of the EU Withdrawal Act.
But as a backstop position.
Well, the backstop is not acceptable to the Prime Minister because it involves having different arrangements for Northern Ireland. I think there will be a degree of discussion and negotiation on this, but you can't... I mean, you talk about immigration and giving way in respect of freedom of movement. Very interesting poll just came out in the last 24 hours where now that people can see what Brexit really looks like, when the rubber's hitting the road on negotiations, and they're asked, what do you prioritise, jobs and businesses or immigration control? They're putting the economy and jobs first. And, I mean, you gave Switzerland as the example. You will know, because I know I've read your stuff, that within the context of the European Economic Area, it is right that you are still part of the free movement regime. I know that. But some of those EEA, European Economic Area countries, have been able to apply more control in terms of the way they manage migration. And frankly, this is a debate more generally across Europe about reforming the way that... I think free movement's actually misleading, because it's not this kind of uncontrolled immigration. Priti will disagree with me, but it isn't.
I do disagree, because, you know, the point that we made to the British public, and the Prime Minister has said this too, she wants an independent immigration policy. And, you know, I believe her when she says that that's what she wants to achieve. She's been categorically clear about literally taking back control of our borders and ending free movement. She, as a former Home Secretary, could not have been clear about that even in her tenure as Home Secretary. So these pillars matter. They matter a great deal. We know that there will be some give and take. Come on, I mean, we're realists about that.
So what are you prepared to give on immigration?
However, I'm not. I mean, the Prime Minister isn't as well. There's a very clear red line.
Are you sure about that?
There's a very clear red line.
She hinted that there might be a case for preferential treatment for EU workers.
In fact, that is some of the suggestion, I think, actually, through this mobility framework, the language that has been used.
Which is a form of free movement, as far as I can make out.
So there you go. So we cannot say that you're going to have an independent policy and you're ending free movement if, by default, you are actually setting something up.
What people clearly want is to have control from the UK side over migration. Now, that may be that they're actually quite relaxed about people coming, particularly to work in the health service or in education or in building houses or whatever else. But they want their parliamentarians, you guys, to have control of that. And if they don't like what you're doing, they'll vote you out.
But what you could do is you could have more stringent controls in terms of, say, the low-skilled immigration, in terms of high-school immigration, like your doctors and nurses. I know, but this is a discussion that you would need to have with the European Union. This is one thing I've definitely detected. In terms of the way free movement operates, I'm not denying that we'd have to sign up to the overall principle, but the way it works is definitely a big point of discussion. President Macron, who is supposed to be, he's depicted as this champion of Eurofederalism, which he frankly isn't, by the way. His own administration...
He was wrapped in the flag, literally, walking onto I don't know what your idea of a federalist is.
But he's not proposing it. In terms of non-Eurozone countries, he's accepted that there will be a different form of membership. So I think the idea that this isn't a dynamic situation, it is a dynamic situation, but we've got to get real. They're not going to give us all the benefits of membership without
we're going to talk a little bit more about the EU reaction. I mean, do you accept, Priti, that compromise was necessary on the Brexiteer side to get to this point?
I don't think it's about the Brexiteer side. I think, we've got to be realistic, but also this is the first time we've had something come together.
What I mean. And it came as a result of...
But it is an enormous compromise on the very areas, Joe, that I've already highlighted and we've spoken about. So the reality is, there's a bit of time, there's a white paper to come yet. We haven't seen the white paper. We don't know what the details of this white paper will be. We need to ensure that we are being authentic to exactly the commitments that we gave to the British public and were in our manifesto.
By the way, you lost your majority off the back of that manifesto.
You work for Michael Gove. Are you surprised that he's still here when Boris has gone, when David Davis has gone, Steve Baker following him, that Michael Gove, a leading Leave campaigner, is still in post?
I think the fact is that Leave campaigners were divided over this question of how much compromise was required and what the right answer was. Michael Gove is one person who's remained in the cabinet, but obviously so is Andrea Leadsom.
But will people feel betrayed?
Dominic Raab has also remained in the cabinet. Look, I think I think there's a strong case for a compromise. My concern comes, what happens if Brussels says no and tries to pressure her into further compromises? That, I think, is very, very difficult. We've made a generous offer, but now I think it needs to be taken very seriously on the continent.
Well, Henry Newman, that is a good point to go to Brussels and talk to Gavin Lee. Thank you for coming.